Hello. I'm going to start by talking about formalism and doing a mini lecture on that, and then I'm going to do another one for the Shklovsky. Um, I'm going to keep them short because you have two to watch, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about your assignment that you're going to do for Friday's class. Okay, so we're reading the chapter in Bressler's book about formalism. If you don't have the book, the PDF is on Canvas, so you can read the PDF. And the chapter on formalism is broken down into Russian formalism and new criticism. And we can call both of them kinds of formalism. I'm just going to refer to them as formalism. And let me back up. Before now, in the olden days, like in the 19th century, people would just read books and learn as much as they could about the author and his life. It's always a his. And then like magically get the poem, just sort of understand the story. And we still do this to some extent. Like when we were talking about Garcia Marquez, we wanted to know about the history of Colombia or the history of the political situations and religious situations. And that gives us information about the story. But if we didn't look at the language in the story at all, we would be doing something like what people in the 19th century were doing. The formalists came along and pointed out that if you wanted to understand what was happening in the story or what it meant, you could just read the story and talk about the story instead of talking about just Garcia Marquez or just the political situation, and that there might be clues in the actual text that point out to you what the story is doing or what it's about or what it's maybe asking of us. People who pay attention to the actual words on the page are the people I'm calling formalists, and that includes both Russian formalism and new criticism. I'm going to talk about new criticism first, which is not the way your chapter is set up. New criticism works by, I'll say new criticism speaks about literature as if everything were a poem. That's fine. I'm just going to say poem. New criticism works by figuring out what a poem means based on the poem's internal logic. So a poem might have paradoxes or questions or problems or tensions that end up getting resolved or answered by the end of the poem. And if you know how to read a poem properly, then you'll be able to get the poem, understand what it means. And you do that by, of course, you're welcome to look at dictionaries. It's not like you're supposed to pretend you don't have outside knowledge. You can look up allusions to other texts. But you don't need to know about the author, for example, or the kind of biographical criticism that you would find in the 18th century. So this makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, and started this whole movement in literary theory where you actually do close reading. We talk about close reading all the time. That's where it comes from, the new critics. The Russian formalists were doing something that's really different, but in retrospect along the same lines. The Russian formalists were taking literature and trying to look at it as literature and not just as propaganda or politically motivated storytelling. The Russian government in the 20s was pretty fierce, and the Russian formalists actually couldn't just publish their work. It had to be smuggled out of Russia. And they're formalists because they too were interested in what was on the page, what the words looked like in a story and what they were doing in a story independent of whether or not that supported Lenin in some interesting way, or criticized the West in some interesting way, but just actually looking at how literature worked. So the two schools together that I'm calling formalism are really an effort to look at words on the page in poems or stories, do close readings, figure out how they work, independent of the biography of the author or the political agenda behind the words. Okay, so we'll talk about this more on Friday. I'm going to talk in another short video about the Shklovsky. Okay.